Hello, I'm Matthew Malcolm with California Dairy Magazine, reporting to you here at the Kearney Agricultural Research and Extension Center. I'm here with Jeff Dahlberg to talk about sorghum silage, a crop that has grown increasingly in popularity and interest in recent years due to the drought and the lack of water or available water for farmers. And, it's would you say it's somewhat comparable to corn, but it's not the same. So wanted to talk about the differences in a feed grower that's putting in a crop of sorghum versus corn. Nutritional wise, what are your recommendations? How do you treat it differently?
Sure. Sorghum forages are not new to California. Back in the late 1800s, actually, the USDA introduced sorghum as a drought-tolerant feed crop for cattle here in the state. So it's not a new crop. It's been in the state for a long time. We're just starting to relearn how to grow it here in the state. So there are some significant differences on what you do. Plant population is really important on forage sorghums, and so you have to understand, you're not going to plant 10 pounds per acre or 20 pounds per acre of sorghum grain. You need to think about plant population. That's really important in forage sorghums. The other thing is nutrition. We talk about putting nitrogen down on the field, and if you treat it like corn, you're going to over-fertilize sorghum forages. And if you over-fertilize forage sorghums, they will grow like crazy and they will lodge. So your fertility program is different, and it's really important in sorghum to understand it's different than corn. The other thing is sorghum forages typically don't need as much water as corn. So you can get away with about half to a third of the water that you would on your corn silage and get approximately the same amount of yield. So if you're thinking about yield per inch of water that you're putting down, sorghum is a pretty good crop to think through, especially if you have limited water. Now, if you have unlimited water and you don't care and you just can put as much water as you can on, corn silage is probably a better option for you. But if you're really starting to think about water conservation and using less water, perhaps to save it to use on another crop on your farm, sorghum forage is a really good option. The other thing to think about is that there's several types of forages in sorghum, and that's different than corn. Typically with corn, you just plant corn like any grain corn that you would purchase. Sorghum forages have had separate breeding programs for many, many, many years, really since about the 1970s, and we've been specifically breeding sorghum for the dairy industry and for silage. When you say sorghum, for most people, especially in the United States, they think about a very, very small plant. They think about grain sorghum. Now, you can feed grain sorghum to animals. You have to actually process the grain, right? And so you do that through steam flaking or rolling or cracking the grain, and you can feed that to animals. But grain sorghums are typically just harvested for the grain. When you start getting into the forages, this is when you start looking at harvesting the whole plant. And we have several different types of forages. We have dual-purpose sorghums. So sorghums are about as tall as I am that put on a panicle or a head that produces some grain, or in some cases a lot of grain. And then we have things that are photoperiod sensitive, which means they don't typically flower here in the United States in temperate zones until late October, November. And they can grow to 12, 14, 15 feet tall.
Wow.
Producing a lot of biomass, but the quality of that silage is not as good because you're just basically going for tons. And then we have some specialty sorghums, the brown midrib sorghums. These are sorghums that we found back in the early 1970s, and that brown midrib actually lowers the lignin content in sorghum. So lignin is like the steel structure of a tall building, right?
Right.
You have to have that steel in there to make sure that tall building stands. Well, lignin is kind of like that. So the problem is if you take lignin away, you lose some of that stability, and you can have lodging problems. And we found that out early on. We had people breeding BMR traits into forage sorghums without really thinking about the forage sorghums they were putting it in. And they put them in some pretty unstable forage sorghums, and all we created was a nice BMR forage sorghum that fell on the ground pretty quickly.
Right.
So, we learned early that you have to be careful in the background that you put that brown midrib. What's important about brown midrib? It's much more digestible than just regular sorghum. In fact, the corn folks are moving brown midrib into some of their forage corns now too, because of the digestibility. It's much more digestible.
Right.
So we also understood that we had to do something to prevent that lodging from happening, and we found another gene. It's called the brachytic gene. It actually shortens the length between the leaf, or the internodes, and it actually produces much more stable forage sorghum. So we can have a forage sorghum that's a little less taller than I am, that has this BMR gene and the brachytic genes, and it's much more stable than the thing that doesn't have the BMR, which might be 6-7 feet tall, and which has a problem with lodging. So the BMR gene is really important for the nutrition of the silage, and so you have to just watch that, make sure you're fertilizing correctly. Sorghum forages don't like to be over-fertilized because they will lodge if you do that improperly. They don't like to be overwatered because they'll lodge for that too. So, it's just a little different agronomic strategies that you have to think through, agronomic management practices that you have to think through if you're just used to growing corn.
Well, thanks for the update. Definitely something to consider moving forward. The political landscape is really difficult in California. We know that water's going to continue to be an issue here in California. So read more about this in California Dairy Magazine. I'm Matthew Malcolm, CaliforniaAgNet.com.